Chapter 10. Squared shoulders. Squared shoulders. The white clapboard house stood all night long, drenched and peering through the furious rain. Toby and Dad watched it from partway up the Sugarbush Hill. The river rose to the attic windows. Toby thought of Ribs and Poke and Patricia and Patrick and hoped they had climbed onto trunks or something to keep dry. Dad clenched his fists. He and Toby glanced up at each other without a word. Both of them stared uphill through the bare trees toward the faint glow of the lanterns in the sugar house, sighed, and watched the farm again. Toby yelped in abrupt terror, "Dad, is that our house?" Dad didn't answer for a second. "No." His voice was strangled. "It's Solomon's." Above the roar of Crooked River and the agonized screaming of frantic animals, there came another splintering crash against the iron bridge. Why didn't the bridge get out of the way? He couldn't bear anymore, Toby thought. He simply couldn't, but he had to. If Dad could, he could. He gritted his teeth until his jaws ached. At the crest of the flood, their house was slammed by trees, other houses, ridgepoles of barns from up the valley. But their white house didn't budge. They couldn't see the barn or stable. Without warning, the rain stopped. Dawn broke in a sick, sallow light over the valley. Ragged clouds sprawled every which way over the gradually emerging dark hills. "River's going down," said Dad in a hoarse voice. His broad shoulders sagged as he gazed over the shattered and littered valley. Toby seized his arm. They could see the attic windows. Then they could see the second-story windows. Slowly, the green-painted rooftops of the barn and the stable appeared above the swirling, retreating water. "Well, the buildings didn't go," Dad said dully. "Well, the buildings didn't go," said Dad dully. Toby remembered Cliff's sledgehammer song for making fence. "Put 'em up solid, they won't come down. Hey me, laddie, they won't come down." He guessed that went for houses and barns as well as fences, but they didn't know how many cows they'd lost out of the herd of 40. And the fields, as they appeared bit by bit, were a mess of sodden river sand, cracked trees, broken houses, and drowned animals. Toby guessed Cliff's song went for people, too. Dad hadn't come down either. He was put up solid. His face was haggard, but his eyes grew alert and determined. "Looks like we've got plenty of work to do." "Yes, sir." "You better hike up and see how your mother and the kids are, Toby. I'll get down and take a look around. Tell her to stay there until she hears me blow the cow horn. If I can find it. Otherwise, I'll holler." "Sure, Dad. And try to round up the cows. Get 'em into the clearing and milk 'em with the buckets. Put the milk into the sugar house milk cans. As soon as it's clear down here, we can drive them down to the barn." Dad put his arms around Toby's shoulder. "Thanks for standing by, Toby." "Gosh, Dad, of course." He watched Dad skid down the wet hill, getting muddier than he already was, and he ran toward home. "Jim Clark," choked Toby in the dripping, budded trees. "That's my father." He climbed toward the sugar bush, calling, "Co-boss!" Mom was waiting in the lighted doorway of the sugar house, her eyes smudged with sleeplessness and anxiety. "Your father?" she asked tersely. He just went down the hill, Mom, to see how things are. The house and the barn and the stable are still there. Cliff? Toby bit his lip to stop their trembling. He was washed down the river. He was hanging on to Chris and a hunk of wood. Mom's face turned whiter. That Wanderfoot of his, she said. But we'll find him. We've got to find him. Yep. Mom, don't you worry, Mom said resolutely. Somehow I think he's indestructible. Now what about the cows? Dad said to round them up in the clearing. Dad said to round them up here in the clearing and milk them. We don't know how many made the hill. He said for you and the kids to stay here until he blows the horn or until he yells. All right, Mom said briskly. What are we waiting for? Johnny and Betsy are asleep. I could put out the lanterns now, call the cows again, and we'll get started. Toby bellowed, "Co-boss! Co-boss! Co-boss!" Windyfoot came trotting through the maples, looking as if he'd had a fine night's sleep. Toby hugged the pony's neck. Good morning, Windy, but I wasn't calling you, boy. Glad as I am to see you. Windy whooshed. Booze! Tilly and Tossie, the Belgian farm team, lumbered through the trees, followed by old sway-backed Serena, who took her time. Toby looked at Mom. No cows left? Keep calling, said Mom. Co-boss! Georgette, shouted Toby. Hey, Georgette! All of them can't have gone. Mom pushed nervous fingers through her hair. Caroline, she called. Agatha, Samantha. Georgette, Toby hollered once more. Moo, said Georgette calmly, ambling into the clearing, her tan face mildly curious. Come here, said Toby. He sluiced Georgette off with pails of water from the spring beside the sugar house. While Mom continued to call, he turned a gathering bucket upside down, sat on it, and milked Georgette into another bucket. Windyfoot came up and nuzzled his shoulder. While Mom continued to call, he turned... Wait your turn for breakfast, Windy. Mom, we've got milk for the kids anyway. Yes, said Mom, looking distracted. Her green eyes filled with tears, and she blinked angrily. Maybe the other cows have just wandered farther up the hill and can't hear us. Her voice broken. She turned quickly toward the sugar house. I'd better wake up the young ones and give them some milk, and then we'll go down and get to work. But Dad said to wait till he signaled. Mom turned in the doorway. Your father, she said stubbornly, repeating what Dad had said about her last night, is the craziest, loveliest person I ever hope to meet in this world, but he doesn't know what's good for him. How is anybody going to work on no breakfast? Maybe too soon to show you, but it's there. Besides, said Mom simply, I've got to be there with him right now, and that's all there is to it. She bolted inside the sugar house. Toby shook his head helplessly, leaned his forehead against Georgette's damp side. He would never understand mothers or sisters or girls in general. If he lived to be 100, when they made up their minds, they certainly made them up. They left Georgette tethered to a grazing stake in the clearing for the time being and rounded up the horses. When Toby had lifted Johnny onto Windyfoot, they heard Dad blow a blast on the horn that sounded like a combination of an excited crow flying upside down and a pig with the croup. Johnny bounced on Windy. There's Dad! Hey, there's Dad! It certainly isn't the song of the lark, said Mom dryly, mounting Tilly. Toby rode Tossie, carrying a sap pail of milk for Dad. Something must have happened to the horn, said Johnny cheerfully. or else to his blower. Betsy tossed her bedraggled pigtails. If it was his blower, he couldn't blow. She stated flatly, "Oh my goodness, look at everything. Look all over everything." She gasped and was silent. Even Johnny piped down, staring with awe and fright at the desolate valley. As they rode slowly through the high sand in the front yard, Mom said steadily, "Well, here we are. Listen, all of you, no complaining. We've all got to pitch in and help Dad." "You bet, Mom," Toby said. His eyes smarted from lack of sleep and from wanting to bawl. Betsy echoed him, gasping about in amazement. "You bet, Mom." "I'm not betting," squeaked Johnny. "I'm just going to help." Dad plodded through the wet sand. He looked even worse than he had on the hill. He went up to Tilly, held out his arms to Mom. "Slide down, Mary." He carried her to the side kitchen door. "You kids, wait a minute." They looked at each other. "I guess we'd better," said Toby. Dad plowed through the silt, carried Mom over the threshold into the kitchen. When he came out, he looked a trifle happier. Dad carried Bets in his arms and Johnny on his back toward the house. Toby waited for orders, then remembered the pail of milk in his hand. He slipped from Tossie, spilling some of the milk, and thrashed to the kitchen. Puzzled, Windy and the horses neighed after him. "I shoveled some of the debris out," Dad was explaining to Mom, "but it'll take months to get it all clean again. We can't use the stove. It won't dry out for days. I cleared the fireplace. That'll dry out faster." Mom was gazing around the bulging, battered, soaking kitchen. She started to speak, made a strangled noise, tried again. We've got cans if they haven't floated upstairs or somewhere. I'll start breakfast in the fireplace, children. We'll play pioneers for a while, all right?" "Pioneers! Indians," said Johnny eagerly. "Here's the milk," said Toby. "Where'll I put it?" He contemplated the pantry door, which was piled with the kitchen table, the Boston rocker, the wood box, and the radio, which had somehow drifted in from the living room. "On the stove, please," answered Mom, "until I figure out some other place." There was a frantic, scrambling racket upstairs. Barks, meows, and grunts set up a wild uproar. The children rushed for Johnny's room. They couldn't open the water-swollen door. Ribs barked, jumped at the door. Poke serenaded them in no uncertain terms and scratched. Patricia and Patrick squealed, grunted, honked, and pushed. The door held. They tried it with Toby holding the knob, Bets grabbing his waist, Johnny holding on to Betsy's waist. They all hauled together time after time. Nothing happened. Then Toby had a bright idea. "Screwdriver. We'll take the door off the hinges." He found a screwdriver and a small tack hammer in the jumble that littered the floor of his own room. Wood carving tools, charcoal sticks, drawing pencils, marbles, buttons he'd popped. String, glue, pastel crayons, oil paint tubes, odd keys, a sodden catnip mouse belonging to Poke, a chewed tennis ball belonging to Ribs, and his boxing gloves that Mr. Burnham had given him for Christmas. Holding the screwdriver and the tack hammer, he gazed, stricken at the drawings of horses on his walls. The charcoals were smudged beyond recognition. In spite of his attempts at using fixative property, the pastels were dizzy blurs of washed-out color. The pencil drawings were discolored, water-stained, bulging grotesquely. Dad's and Mom's long years of work on the farm were ruined too. What was he yelping about? He could quit being a darn crybaby. He stamped back to Johnny's door, lugging his straight chair. "Okay, kids, gangway. Bets, grab the screws when I hand them down, and don't lose them. Johnny, talk to the animals and see if you can calm them down." Betsy held out both hands. "I won't drop them." Johnny leaned against the door and sang, "Oh, Poke and Ribs, we don't tell fibs. Oh, Ribs and Poke, we'll get you, Oak. Patricia, hush, you're squealing. Pat, We'll have you out and nothing flat. He looked up at Toby. I'm not singing very well this morning. I'm too sleepy, and my stomach feels funny. Besides, where's Cliff? Toby had been dreading the question. He knew that either Betts or Johnny would ask it sooner or later, and he'd been trying to figure out what to say. He fussed with the top hinge, which was already free. He had to tell them the truth. Cliff went on a sailing foot jaunt with Chris under one arm and a beam under the other. Betsy cried sharply, Cliff, with my Chris? Toby kept his voice steady. Here, Bet, another screw. Thanks, yeah. Before the worst of the flood began, he's probably all right, and so is Chris. Mom says not to worry. We'll find them. Bets wept as if her heart were broken. Johnny said he'd better come straight back here. He managed to control the wobble in his voice, but he couldn't stop the tears that rolled down his round cheeks. If he doesn't, I'll tell him exactly what I think of him. He can't go sailing footing without me. Toby got down from the chair. Here, Johnny, please hold the hammer. I'll have this bottom hinge loose in a minute. He shoved the chair out of the way, squatted to work on the hinge. I'll settle this hash, threatened Johnny with a quaver. You wait and see, so there. Whoops, kids, Toby cried. Here comes everybody. He swung the door loose. Ribs made a dive for him, barking and wagging, kissed Betsy, kissed Johnny, and bowled the small boy over and streaked for downstairs. Poke stepped disdainfully over the wet hall floor, said, "Me-row," and followed Ribs with a high, indignant tail, pausing to give Johnny's face a brief wash before he could scramble to his feet. Johnny began to laugh, got halfway up, was stampeded by Patricia and Patrick, who grunted over his stomach before they tumbled down the stairs. The way they honk, said Johnny affectionately. Toby, may I borrow your handkerchief, please? It's wet. Oh, gosh, everything's wet. Yours ought to be drier. I guess it is, said Johnny, wiping his face. Toby took the door completely off, leaned it against the wall. I had better let it dry out before I put it back on. Come on, Bets. Race you downstairs. She shook her head, went into her own room, and closed the door. Carry me pick-a-back, demanded Johnny. All right, hop on. In the living room, Mom was struggling with the fireplace and the damp wood. Toby, I'll never get this fire started in a year. In a year with this wood. If the sun comes out, we could dry some out in the yard. But right now, let me think. What about the horses, Mom, and Wendy? Dad's tethered them in the yard for a while, until the stable's cleaned out. Oh, I know. Come up on the attic. In the attic, they found a discarded rocker, hanging from a beam, a slab-sided commode, and a chest of drawers with 3 legs, piled on top of some other furniture, and fortunately dry. They carried them down to the woodshed, and Toby set to work with the axe. By the time he had a good pile of kindling and sizable pieces of wood, Mom had also discovered a batch of dry newspapers in the attic, and had dug oatmeal and sugar that were in cans with screw tops out of the confusion of the pantry. It was impossible to investigate the fruit cupboard in the cellar. The water was still more than halfway up the cellar stairs. The electricity was off and the phone was still silent. Tell Dad to come in for breakfast, Mom said, in about 15 minutes. Toby found Dad squaring his shoulders in the barnyard. I can't eat anything just yet, he said. Want to come along? Toby squared his shoulders too. Yes, sir, you bet, Dad. And he went with Dad to survey the awful desolation of the barn with its dead cattle, its destroyed hay and grain, to gaze silently with Dad over the river-cut, river-battered acres of what had once been a beautiful farm. Show you that picture again. That's the end of the chapter. That one didn't get smudged, thank goodness.